Um, so what is motivation? Motivation are forces that energize an organism to act and that direct its activity. There are extrinsic motivations, which are extrinsic rewards, which we have seen so far, being moved to do something because of some external reward, like money or winning a game, etc. And there are also intrinsic motivations. An organism being moved to do something because it is inherently enjoyable. It's interesting, it's novel, he's curious about it, it's helping him learn, etc. And then there's another type of intrinsic necessity that I put in the list, which is not to distinguish essentially this curiosity and this drive for learning and drive for something novel to a drive that causes us to satisfy our hunger, satisfy our thirst, find shelter from rain, etc. Okay, both of them are intrinsic. Okay, but one is a drive to something likable, and the other is a drive to something necessary. Okay, now why is this important, and why we should care about it? First of all, we need to adapt the reinforcement learning diagram that we've seen before. Most or rather all rewards are intrinsic. Yes, our agent interacts with the external world, but most of the time those rewards comes either from internal necessities or internal desires. Okay? Yes, the important thing, because I got some questions after the previous lecture, is that the extrinsic motivation is task dependent, while the intrinsic motivation is task independent. And it has been noted in 1966 by Berlin, but from other scientists as well, that curiosity goes beyond hunger, beyond thirst, beyond, let's say, sexual appetite. It's a different drive that moves us, the live organism, towards exploration and learning. And now the important question that comes in our mind is, why should we care about it? Well, we should care because if curiosity is this general cost function, and that if we could somehow code up in our agents, then we would have agents that could learn almost autonomously with very little supervision, okay? Very little human supervision. And will learn multiple tasks, and once they solve one task, they go to another task, and they will create automatic curricula, as we'll see later. This comes straight out of curiosity, straight out of our learning progress, because an organism will learn that a task that I already know will not contribute to my learning progress, and a task that is too hard will also not contribute to my learning progress. Exactly the same that if you take a very difficult math textbook, you throw it away, you say, maybe I should try to nail down the easier concepts first, okay? So if we use learning progress or curiosity as our cost functions, we can achieve this online continual learning. And why this is not a trivial result? Well, because many people would think that what drives humans is not curiosity, but rather, let's say, reproduction, right? We have babies and the babies have babies, and how can we code up such reproduction in our agents? We cannot, okay? So there is a deadlock right there, but curiosity, in fact, we can. Not only we can, but people have already started doing this already from early 1990s. So this is Eugen Schmidt-Huber, when he was young, published many papers where he was developing agents that they had as mere reward to develop this internal world model, okay? The transition dynamics that we saw in our previous lecture, okay? And in his first papers, he was saying that the agent doesn't want to get bored, so he's going to seek states and actions that will cause his world model to fail, will cause large prediction error, okay? Do you remember, for those that were here in last lecture, this is exactly what we discussed. How can we encode curiosity rewards, exploration bonuses based on prediction error, okay? Is there any questions so far? I'm just trying to put what we did in the previous lecture in a more context. So this is what the Eugen is saying. He's saying you don't need to devise a different algorithmic setup to utilize these exploration bonuses. Just use exactly the same thing you were using for startup task specific rewards, but right now these rewards will be intrinsic, Okay? And indeed, that's exactly what we did. We computed exploration bonuses and we put them as rewards in actor-critic architectures. Okay? Now, let me do a very quick overview of what we saw. Well, first of all, we talked about pseudo-counting. How do we visit states that we haven't seen before? This is not what I want to discuss again, but basically at that stage, these exploration bonuses were dependent on those pseudo-counts. The larger the count, the lower the bonus, which means I've been in that state before or I've been in similar states before. And we also talked about this type of exploration bonuses based on prediction error. The larger the prediction error, the larger the bonus. All right? And the important thing to keep in mind is that those exploration bonuses, these intrinsic rewards, in contrast to the extrinsic reward, you will always, when you kill a monster, you will always be rewarded in Atari games. Here, when you are exploring, in the beginning when you kill a monster, you'll be rewarded, something new is happening. Later, you will not. You'll say, okay, I just killed a monster, nothing new here. Okay, I've seen this before many times. So those rewards are non-stationary, and we need to take care of this. And a very small trick that people do is that they compute Monte Carlo rewards and TD rewards because the TD targets take too long to assimilate these quick changing rewards. So what I thought last time is that I told you, you know what, predicting pixels is bad, forget about it. But I didn't go into details to show you that, yes, people have tried predicting pixels directly, predicting raw pixel observations. Okay, so let me just give one example of this. What is this here? It's a standard next step function, a transition dynamics, in this case, visual dynamics. Our current state is represented with an image or an image sequence. We also fit the action. We want to predict the next state, in this case, the next observation. Okay? Is that clear? Everything's clear so far? Okay, so I just want to discuss one work that exactly does this such a pixel prediction and used it for exploration, okay? And I want to show you results to see in what state our frame prediction algorithms are right now. Well, in a nutshell, what this work did, action conditional video prediction using deep neural networks in Atari games, is that given an image or an image sequence and an action, they predict the pixels of the next frame, exactly what we saw before. Then, because you don't care just to predict the next frame, but rather the next 300 frames, you need to unroll your model forward. You'll feed your predictions back as input. So we'll see what tricks you need to do in your course function for this to work. And then they used this frame prediction to come up with an exploratory behavior for DQN. And so they didn't use the prediction error because apparently this simple thing didn't work very well. But what they do is that they're about to choose an action. They have 16 alternatives. They feed every action, they predict the next frame. They have a buffer of recent frames visited, and they measure the dissimilarity of those predicted frames to what you've seen, and you pick the action that will send you to the most dissimilar frame so that you avoid this epsilon greedy behavior of running around like this, back and forth, okay? Very simple. Yes, of course they improved over DQN. Everybody can improve over epsilon greedy. It's just very naive exploration. Two neural architectures, one feed forward and one recurrent. They're extremely simple. Please pay attention so that we can completely understand what's happening. In the first case, you will feed 4 frames as input. Why 4 frames? You want to capture the velocity of the objects, so one image is not enough. And you will pass them through some convolutional layers. The action is going to come, okay? The action is also going to encode it potentially in some low-dimensional encoding. You combine them, and then you decode them into the next frame. So this is the feed-forward network. This recurrent network essentially takes only one image as input, but also has a hidden state to remember the previous history, okay? And takes the action and again a similar CNN encode decode. All right? And one interesting detail is the following. There are 2 ways to combine your state encoding, this low-dimensional vector, with your action encoding. Either you'll concatenate them, or you'll have multiplicative interactions. Okay? Now, on top of the concatenation, if you put a deep enough network, potentially it will discover these multiplicative interactions, but if you put them directly in the architecture, you'll make it easier for the network to learn to relate a particular action with a particular state encoding. Do you see? So we have these multiplicative interactions in both architectures. I don't think you need to worry too much about this. An important thing to know is this forward unrolling. In both cases, either in the feed-forward mapping or in the recurrent mapping, you'll take your prediction and feed it back as input, predict the next frame, feed it back as input, predict the next frame, feed it back as input, and continue like this. My question is, what can go wrong while training such a model? Let's think. So in the beginning, your predictions will be garbage, right? The outputs will be 0 because the weights of your acquired initializers are 0. So if you try to take losses for, let's say, a 5-step prediction period, and what is the loss? L2 pixel intensity loss, the standard pixel loss. The problem is that you will be feeding back in garbage predictions, all right? Do you all understand this? So then what will the network learn? To predict something out of garbage. So the way we do it is we do progressive unrolling. So first, we train for 1 frame forward. We overfit, okay? So now we see we can predict well the next frame. Then we expand the period of prediction to 2, and we put losses both on the next frame and the frame after the next. Then we expand to 3, 4, 5, 300, as much as we like. If you don't do this, errors compound, and even if you train an extremely sharp next frame prediction, once you unroll it, things will go very fast to very bad, very high error, okay? Now, the interesting thing here is the videos. They look pretty good. Let's see if they play. Oh, well, they didn't, right? Okay, here it is. So this is Paid Invaders. On the left is the Learn Simulator, unroll forward, and on the right is Ground Truth. Notice that what is missing are the bullets. The bullets are these tiny little things that are spiked up. These are extremely small objects, and small objects don't generate large loss under this standard L2 error. And this is precisely the problem. As we said the other day, the same problem with autoencoders. You try to predict pixels, but often a very tiny region is relevant for what you care, for the task you care about. Okay, a lot of blue background, if even it was green or yellow or white, it wouldn't mind, okay? It wouldn't matter. Now, having said that, we are able to show these beautiful results in simulator for Atari games, deterministic environments, okay, or close to deterministic, and very toy visuals. Once you go to a real world, if you try to do such frame prediction, and we'll see this type of models in the next lecture, where we're going to discuss about model-based reinforcement learning. Some of those models will be on visual dynamics. You will see that very, very fast. You will see super blurry outputs, okay? So now, what question should we all have in our minds? Okay, so this is not an important slide. It just shows that such informed exploration improves over epsilon greedy. And the only change is this. Instead of the epsilon greedy choice of the action, you choose an action that minimizes similarity to a trajectory buffer. I didn't show the equation here of the similarity. This is the important question. What should we be predicting about? What should we care to predict? And our next lecture will also be about this question. Observations have a lot of information. It's very difficult to predict raw pixels. They're very high dimensional. Moreover, there are a lot of things that the agent cannot control and cannot thus predict. They're stochastic. Beyond that, there are a lot of things that are irrelevant. We should not care to predict those parts of the image, okay? So this is the realization that we said the last time, and I don't want to go into details of our alternative solutions that we proposed. Just to remind you, we said, let's train an autoencoder and let's predict the encoding, okay? And we said the problem is that the autoencoder also is completely task irrelevant. Then we discussed about this super interesting alternative, okay, which combines forward model and inverse model so that this frame encoding is able to predict the action of the agent. That's all you care about. So this means that the state encoding will forget about any part of the frame that is not necessary to predict the action. So it will neglect anything that the agent cannot predict, cannot control. All right? So very nice and succinct state encoding in this way. Then we said, let's use random neural networks and fix them and train dynamics on top of them. And interestingly, this worked well for Atari games, okay, the embarrassing part. And then we saw all these alternatives. We said, okay, so far we've seen only task rewards. Then we can combine task rewards with curiosity rewards. Then we can have extremely sparse task rewards, terminal. I don't reward you for killing monsters. I only reward you if you finish the game, okay? And then we said, what if we use only curiosity rewards, and forget about task? And people, using only curiosity, the other way to say it is no reward reinforcement learning, is not new. There are many, many papers on this domain, even from 1985 and onwards. However, the one that we visited is a very recent one. I think it's going to appear in NIPS 2018, okay? Which use this modern machinery, A3C, actor critic, asynchronous actor critic, and deep neural networks for prediction error for the exploration bonuses. And so these are new things. So what we saw here is that curiosity helps more the sparser the task rewards, okay? So this is nothing surprising. Nothing surprising, and the thing is that most of the time, the task rewards are extremely sparse, okay? So interestingly, oftentimes you will hear in deep learning that you need to train for exactly what you're going to test on. Because if you train for an objective that is not exactly matching the test objective, you're not going to do well, okay? So this is not the case here. You train using curiosity rewards, and you end up having policies that collect a lot of task-related rewards, okay? Because the task-related rewards are just so sparse. And if you train only for task-related rewards, you end up with policies that do much worse, okay? So what does this mean? This means that curiosity, in terms of prediction error, at least for video games, is a good proxy for solving the game. If you will try to plan so that you cause your predictive model to fail, you will end up solving Super Mario, okay? Because you will be trying to see new things again and again. So now my question is, what if Super Mario didn't have levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but only had level 1, okay? And we, start an agent that is only driven by curiosity, and that is learning this model, okay, with these neural networks, inverse model, forward model, and computes exploration bonuses, collects experience, retrain this model. What's going to happen eventually? I mean, from the previous lecture, you remember that this curiosity-driven policy was able to pass 10 levels. Okay, so we know that it's going to, at some point, we'll be able to finish level 1. Now, what's going to happen if you continue training it on level 1? It's going to happen what happened to your policies, that once they were able to solve the carpal, okay, then the experience buffer essentially just collected transitions along this optimal policy and forgot about the rest of what to do in the rest of the space. So here again, if we're able all the time to win the game, we will learn the model that, you know what, in this way I win the game. Winning the game will not be interesting anymore because I've seen it, and then maybe if I kill myself, it's going to be more interesting, right? So of course you will see the curiosity-driven policy to degrade. The cool thing, though, is that our world is very interesting. We will never find such a bottleneck that we've solved everything, okay? So coming here, I had this thought about these superstars, super smart mathematicians. Mathematicians actually don't suffer from this problem, but super successful singers, right? In the beginning, they strive for curiosity to try to do better and better and better. They reach the plateau of absolute success, and then they try drugs to surprise themselves, right? Because somehow they just reach this plateau of, if you, in the right direction, they couldn't make any more curiosity progress. Now, well, so this policy now that is jumping, it has been trained on this other environment. Okay, so because intrinsic motivation is task independent, okay, you can train a policy in one environment, put it in another environment. Of course, you can fine-tune it. What does it mean, fine-tune it? Again, with curiosity, but in these new textures of dark textures, because Mario has a, okay, somehow the videos are, come on, man. Okay, Keynote is not happy now, that's fine. Okay, so let's go to this now. So we saw what prediction error as exploration bonus can do. Now I'm asking you, what do you think are the limitations of implementing computational curiosity as prediction error? When do we think that just using this L2 of our transition model will not cause our agent to do learning progress? Yes?
What if there's like 1,000 very creative ways to die in the game?
I didn't hear what you said.
Like what if there's like 1,000 very creative ways to die in the game and the winning path is very boring? Then like by curiosity it'll explore all the different ways to lose.
To die.
Yeah.
And once you explored all of them? Oh, if it's easier to, no, that's not right. So we said that before. The thing is that as soon as you win, okay, even if there's only one way to win, then you will end up in the next level. So you were just going to get surprised yourself for the next level, right? But I agree, if you get stuck there, then of course this is going to be boring, and then you'll switch to the dying behaviors, as we said earlier. Yes?
You can be addicted to very interesting things, so stuck there and become
Like what? Very interesting.
Very that can cause much high information entropy or something like that.
Right. Like what?
For example, the environment, just to give you a random examples.
Right. So if you're in a stochastic environment and somehow you cannot fit this predictive model, you will never get out of there. You'll just stay there because each time you're going to have a high prediction error. So each time you will be rewarding those states that inherently are predictable. Okay? And so how could we test that? So imagine we're training an agent to navigate this maze, and at some point we give to our agent a telecontrol, a remote. So let's see what's going to happen. Oh, well, we didn't manage to see what's going to happen. So now it worked, the video. Okay, there is some certain stochasticity here. Okay, fine. So now it's going to start jumping. This is good. And then if it's fine-tuned, it's going to do even better. That's wonderful. We will get back to transfer policies. Okay, here it is. So he is navigating. This is all good. And then I put the TV. And then he's just playing with the remote and surprising himself all the time. And the predictive model never fits. So basically, using... and that's it. So using the prediction error, it has exactly this problem. What if the environment is stochastic? Now, I want to mention right here the following. We have assumed that this predictive model has high capacity. If your model has low capacity, you will start experiencing high prediction error even in deterministic cases when your model just cannot fit. So there is this implicit assumption, okay, that your predictive model is high capacity. Now, let's try to see what we can do to fight stochasticity. This is exactly what your colleague said, that the agent will forever be attracted to noisy states. So this should not be super surprising. We know that regression fails once for the same input you have multiple outputs with multiple modes, okay? Because the least square solution is just to go in the middle, all right? So that we know. We know that regression fails under multimodal outputs. What we need to know is how to handle this. So there are two ways we can go about it. Either we can add stochastic units in our network. So some units are just going to be sampled, and as you sample them and propagate those values in the network, then you'll end up predicting different things. and then you'll use this distribution to compute your prediction error by using, for example, the closest sample. Okay, so some of those samples may be close to the particular outcome that you saw, so that's nice. Or you need to have stochastic weights. Again, you sample the weights of your neural network, you feed the same input, but with each sample weights, you have different outputs, correct? So either one you can do or the other. Great, so here is the stochastic units. The yellow layer has this z's, right, that the previous layer has proposed given the weights, their weights and their inputs, state and action. They propose the mean and the sigma of those stochastic units. Then you sample from those Gaussians, and then you push those Gaussians in the later layers. So we'll go on this in detail. We're going to have like a 5-10 minutes tutorial of this, and then I'm going to point you to other tools you can read if you want more details. So how the exploration reward is going to change, where either you can take the mean across your Z samples or just the expectation across your Z samples. Both would be better than just regression, okay, with all deterministic units. The other thing you can do is you can make this network Bayesian. Okay, Bayesian network, the theta is not just one point estimate, but rather distribution. You sample from the distribution, you get a different network. It's like an infinite ensemble, okay? Tons and tons of samples each time you sample. Each weight is parameterized by a Gaussian or a small mixture of Gaussians, okay? You don't pay that much cost on more parameters. Now, the difficult thing is how do you train those models, okay? Now, before we go into how do you train those models, let's see more closely what this does. I just said we're going to sample those stochastic units from Gaussians, okay? Now, we all think in our minds that Gaussians are extremely simple. Okay, yes, but the thing is, that if we sample from a simple distribution, but then we fit the output into some complicated function, okay, which is the laters that come after those stochastic variables, those Gaussians can be transformed in arbitrary ways to approximate our output. So we should not worry about it, okay? We should not worry about it. This is not like the old mean field approximation where we were stuck with the Gaussians. Now, the Gaussians enter into this deep, non-linear transformations of the later layers. This is a nice figure, how you can go from that simple Gaussian to this nice ring. Now, the G here, we decided the F. We're going to train this F so that we maximize our objective. Now, let's see how to train. Now, to make things simple, let's forget about the conditioning, and we'll add the conditioning later. For now, let's just assume we want to build a good generative model of images. We want to be able to sample noise, Z's, and transform them into realistic samples, okay, from the image manifold. How would we train this? Well, this doesn't say anything. The only thing that it says is that at the output of the network, we're not going to have discretion. We're going to have a Gaussian for every pixel. So for every pixel, what you care to predict is the mean of that Gaussian. This Gaussian will have a constant standard deviation. This is what you always have been doing. When you minimize L2, it's as if you're maximizing data likelihood under a Gaussian distribution. Okay, so this is nothing. I'm just noting it this for completeness. Okay, so we haven't said something interesting yet. Well, what we're going to do now that we have these latent variables, well, we'll try to maximize data likelihood, but the data likelihood now includes the marginalization across this latent variable Z. And this integral is intractable. Why? Because there are too many Z combinations to compute so that you, to be able to compute this integral correctly. So the first thing that we can do when we have a problem is like we forget we have this problem. You say, I don't care. I'm still going to sample from the Z's. And why you may be tempted to sample from the Z's? Mostly because we have had a lecture before and we know how to take gradients. That's the beautiful thing, because there is an expectation under Z. The Z comes from a constant distribution, has nothing to do with parameters. So once you take derivative with respect to theta, this derivative can enter into the expectation. Correct? All right? Well, the thing is that So maximizing the algorithm is minimizing the minus of log likelihood. Sum over all the examples of our data set. For each example, we draw a number of z samples, okay? And here, the probability of the image given the sample, actually this should be zi, all right, like here. And this is very, we can compute this and take gradients. There is nothing difficult here. And we call this sampling from the prior. We have a paper on motion prediction under multimodality conditions stochastic networks where you can see how this naive solution performs in comparison to others. Because everybody says, oh, this doesn't work. It's not clear to everybody that this shouldn't work. I mean, in this case, yes, but later in the conditioning, we're going to see it's not clear. So there we compare against this way of training. Now, what does variational inference, what the idea introduces? It says we cannot sample from disease, okay? Because sampling there is not guided. Most of those z's will be irrelevant, will end up to really bad images that have nothing to do with my image X. Okay, I have a particular image. I want to maximize this likelihood. If you just randomly sample z's, you have, let's say, 500 z's, 500 Gaussians, there is a very big space. Okay, how can you find the z's that lead to good X's? So what we're going to do? We're going to sample from a different distribution, the variational approximation distribution Q. We always call that distribution Q. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to make this distribution Q close to the posterior, what we care about, the probability of z given that image. Well, that posterior, for sure, we cannot estimate. But let's see how we can make progress, okay? So we're trying to bring our Q distribution, which we're going to parameterize and optimize, okay? To minimize, we're going to optimize so that we minimize the scale divergence between this variational approximation and our true posterior. So let's see how the math works out. Well, the first line is by the definition of scale divergence. We've seen it in previous lectures when we talked about natural gradients, okay? Then we take the log of the numerator minus the log of the denominator in the second line. In the third line, we have the Bayes rule, right? The probability of z given x, probability of x given z, multiplied with probability of z, divided by the probability of image x, okay? So by the way, this variational approximation happens for each example x. For each example, we need to infer the latent z's, okay? I'm mentioning this because later that we'll use similar variational inference to estimating weights of a neural network. This is not the case. All images will contribute to finding the weights of the network, okay? So let's continue. So there's nothing that we did here interesting. We have the Bayes rule, and then we just decompose this fraction into the two nominators and minus the denominator, okay? Now the thing to observe is that, well, let's reorganize the terms. So how can we reorganize them? Yes, you can take this, and together they make a new KL, and then you have this term, and then you have that term, okay? And this term doesn't depend at all on the variational approximation Q, okay? So it's not going to affect your optimization. So in any case, you see how the math works out. Now let's try to understand what's going on here. We have some prior over z. You have some prior over z. Now my question to you is, what prior over z are we going to use? Deep variational inference says, don't worry about it. In any case, those z's are going to enter into some super complex nonlinear transformations. Choose a very simple prior over z. I say we use independent Gaussian, zero mean and unit variance, all right? Very simple. So we have our prior, and we say, look, the Q that you're seeking, that is conditioned on X, by the way, this Q, you can totally make it not conditional on X, but things will not work very well. Because to predict good Z's, okay, you need to kind of know about the image X. I'm going to get to this point. But basically here we say, you know, your Q better not be super complex, better be close to prior, okay? And at the same time, this is the regularization term. At the same time, we need to be able to explain those X's. This is exactly this neural network in the previous slide that takes Z and produces X, okay? Do you see? the probability of x given z. And then a term that doesn't depend on q. So what is the optimization problem that variational inference solves? It's exactly this. We try to minimize this KL, and at the same time maximize this data term. This is called the reconstruction, and this is the regularization. And why it's called variational autoencoder? Why we call this, we usually call it variational autoencoder. Do we see an encoder here? An encoder that takes an image and produces a latent vector? Is exactly our variation approximation Q. This is exactly our encoder. And do we see a decoder here? Something that takes Z and produces X, which very much should remind us of the neural network in the previous slide. Yes, this is it, okay? So don't get confused. Those variational autoencoders don't have much to do with the standard autoencoders. It's just that at the end of the day, what you're optimizing, okay, has two neural networks, one encoding, one decoding, and that's how the name came, okay? Now here is some very clean formulation of how things came out, and now we will try to make it concrete of how can we optimize this. And here's a beautiful image. We'll take an image X, okay, and this is Q, and this is going to be a deep neural network parameterized with weights phi, okay? And this neural network will predict mu's and sigmas for each of your z's. You can decide to have 50 z's, 500 z's, as many as you like, okay? And then we'll sample from those z's. They're stochastic units because we can sample from them, and then pass them through this decoder P, which has weights theta, which you also need to optimize for, okay? So that the output, f of z, matches your image X. Does this make sense? Now, for those that were here, once we discussed about how do we take gradients of expectations, okay, we know that because here we have an expectation over z, the z depends on the parameters we optimize for, which is what? Phi, the q. To be able to propagate the gradients, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? How we take gradients of expectations when the gradient, the parameter we take the gradient, with respect to which we take the gradient, is in the distribution. So guys, here, for example, let's take this deconstruction loss, okay? There is an expectation over Q, there is an expectation over Z's. You're still going to sample from Z, like before. But now, these Z's are sampled from this informed distribution Q, okay? All right? So the means and sigmas of the Z's are not 0 and 1. They come out of this Q, so they should be way more informed once they train, all right? Now, my question is, how are we going to take gradients on that cost function? I want to tell you that the KL has a closed form solution once everything is Gaussian. Okay, that doesn't depend on sampling, but depends only on mu's and sigmas. All right, you can look up this. Now, this, when I tell you this, doesn't matter. People have used more complex priors, mixture of Gaussians. There is no closed form solution from the KL. They just sample it. Okay, you also add expectation over Z in that term. Now, can you please somebody say how we take gradients over the expectation over Z? What we discussed in the last 2 lectures ago? Yes. Yes, we reparameterize. How will we reparameterize? Instead of sample from Z, which depends on our weights theta, what are we going to do since Z is Gaussian? We will put some helping variable epsilon, which depends on a fixed distribution, 0 mean and unit variance. And we said that there is this beautiful reparameterization trick for Gaussian variables, and we like it because Z is Gaussian. That's why we chose it, okay? And now Z equals mu mu plus sigma epsilon, all right? So now the Z became a deterministic function of our fixed noise epsilon and the outputs of our neural network. So now you can sample from this epsilon and just aggregate gradients through this expectation of fixed epsilon. Okay? I would like to urge you to read this beautiful tutorial by Carl Dorsch, which explains variational tone encoders very well, very intuitively. Okay? And you'll find it online. Now, well, okay, so this looks like this is just a neural network. Backpropagation will give us the gradients. No problem. We'll sum over epsilon. You don't need even that many samples. Yes, this is the reconstruction loss, and this is the KL terms. And I want to tell you something. I want to tell you that the prior we imposed on Z, okay, the prior, this Gaussian with zero mean and unit variance, it has nothing to do with this epsilon. Okay, it's a completely different. You could have chosen a different prior. Okay, you could have chosen a different prior. So the one goes right there in the KL, and the other is where we sample the epsilon from. All right. Now, what happens? Who can imagine how this model will look at test time? We said we're training this to generate images. Now, what you see here is we have this encoder. The encoder, I call it the cheating model because it looks at the image. It looks at the image and tells you what Z to use, right? So, of course, you cannot use this to sample images. What are you going to use to sample images? Well, at test time, you only need the head. Now, we have ensured by optimizing this objective that this prior over Z, which is just this zero mean unit variance Gaussians, are close to the variational distribution. So you can safely use them, and at the same time, we have ensured that the encoder, when the Z comes out of the right place, it will generate correct images. So we'll throw all the model, and we'll just have this at test time. Okay? And here are the images that came from this paper of 2014, I think, on encoding variational base, which introduced this, technology. I would like to say that before that, our latent variables, Z's, were not continuous, were discrete. So when you have discrete latent variables, all these don't work. Reparameterization doesn't work there. Okay? So the beauty is that we have continuous Z's, and we're able to use the reparameterization trick and backpropagate all the way through. Now I want everybody to say, okay, great. How I'm going to use this to predict stochastic dynamics? Condition on some state and action. I want to be able to predict lots of different futures. That's how we started. While here, I told you sample some random noise. Are you okay with the time? We sample some random noise, you generate images. Shouldn't you be conditioning on the current state and action? Yes, you should, and it's extremely trivial. That the math is the same. The only thing that you do is you have this extra conditioning X. The X is used both at training time and at test time. X is the current state and action, is the extra context that you provide to your model, okay? You feed it as input to the variational approximation and the model at test time, and to the decoder. It enters both the encoder and the decoder, okay? So this is a paper we have of how do you predict trajectories in such super stochastic setups. Look at here the stochasticity. We show how regression fails. VAE may also fail if you don't sample enough, and we provide a different loss function. You can look at it if you wish. I also think it's a very gentle, introduction to VAEs. Now, having discussed how to use stochastic units in our network and seeing how simple it is, let's see again how we can use stochastic weights. You remember the motivational slide. I want to be able, so let me show this actually. Why would I care to have stochastic weights? There are two types of uncertainty I'm trying to fight. The first type of uncertainty is shown in the image. My input data is these dark dots. I'm trying to regress to the target Y, which is the Y-axis. I want my network to be able to tell me in some way that beyond this regime, there is no data. So I really cannot trust its predictions, okay? A regression network, a deterministic regression network has no way to say that. A Bayesian network can, because you can sample weights, look at the entropy of the different networks, exactly the same thing we did for ensembles. Okay, so this is the first motivation. You know this motivation because I think I mentioned it last time. Now the second motivation is that not only we'll be able to be uncertain when we have data, but we can also show that we're uncertain once we have multiple multimodal outputs, all right? And we'll be able to move the distributions of our weights so that we capture these multimodal outputs, okay? While if we had a single weight per neuron, we wouldn't be able to, all right? Now, the reason I'm going to show this is just to see how analogous it is. Again, again, estimating those weights, now again we need to estimate the data likelihood. We have an integral. The integral this time is over weights. You need to take an integral over the theta, tons and tons of weight combinations. This integral is intractable. How are you going to do it? Okay, don't worry. I'm going to introduce a Q. I have a Q. Now this Q will predict theta and will be conditioned on some other variables, phi. Some other variables, phi. Before also we had phi. You see, it's the same notation. And this approximation, variation approximation, better be close to my true posterior, which there's no way I can estimate the theta given the data set. However, I need to minimize the scale divergence. That makes sense. This is my optimization. This is how I'm going to fit those weights phi, okay? So that I can end up with thetas that give high likelihood to my data. Expand the KL. Nothing. This is just very simple things. Again, the base rule here. Here is again the terms. I want my Q over those latent weights, theta, to be close to my prior. Now, the first thing you will always discuss and ask yourself is, what family I should use for my prior? Okay, we always do this. For these, we chose zero mean unit variance. For those guys, again, we're going to use Gaussians. The people here in that beautiful paper, let me show this title. Actually, well, the title comes later. Yeah, the people here, once you don't seek a closed form solution for your KL, you can put whatever prior on your theta you want. They put, for example, a mixture of Gaussians. Both are zero mean. You want your weights to be zero mean, right? But one has a tight sigma, the other has a big sigma, okay? And so this is your prior, and you fix the parameters of this. You don't optimize it. They say they try to optimize those two and things collapsed. And they explain why there. And again, you compute gradients in the normal way. Let me show you what. So here is the two terms. The data likelihood, we want the data set to be high likelihood given our theta. Notice here that the same theta, the same parameter theta should be able to explain all my data. While before we have different z's for different images, correct? So that's why my Q here is not conditioned on any X or any input, okay? And this is the KL. I want the weight complexity to be small. I want my weights to be simple, to be close to their prior. Okay, so this has also some nice explanation based on Shannon coding theory, but we're not going to discuss them now. And here is what it is. My phi is just going to be mu and sigmas, the means and the sigmas of the different weights of the network. For every weight, you have million weights, you have million mu's and million sigmas. Okay, 2 scalars for every weight. All right? These are your phis. This is the prior that I discussed with you of the theta. What is K? K is from 1 to 1 million. That's how many weights you have. Okay? You multiply the Gaussians. You use the same P and the same sigma for all of them. Imagine you have a different, how you're going to pick them. And here's again the problem. Let's take gradient. Gradient with respect to phi. What should be my mu's and sigmas? Right? That's what we care about. What should be the mu's and sigmas of the distribution of my weights? Now, why this is a problem? Who can say why this is a problem? Here I just put the expectation over Q, expectation over Q. I took the expectation, I put these terms inside. Why this is a problem? Because we're trying to take gradient with respect to a parameter that is inside the distribution of the expectation. If we didn't have phi here, the gradient would enter the expectation and would be done. We just would aggregate gradients, average. But now we have phi there. What are we going to do? Yes, we will reparameterize. That's exactly what we'll do. And here is how we would do it. Well, phis are Gaussians, okay? So instead of sampling, so thetas are Gaussians, and instead of sampling phi, I'll be sampling epsilon, okay? And the epsilon is from a fixed distribution, and now here is the phi, mu and sigma, so either you call it mu and sigma or phi is the same. And now theta, the weights of my network, are a deterministic function of this noise sample from a fixed distribution and transformed using these phi parameters, okay? This is reparameterization. Let me show you how simple it is now. Sample epsilon, okay, from 0 mean unit 1, form the theta using this equation, it's a deterministic function, take gradients with respect to phi of this expression. Now the theta at the same point is going to also instantiate the network. You can put ReLUs, a lot of things there that don't depend on any parameters. You can instantiate any network you want with these theta weights, okay? You need this network because this is how you're going to estimate this data likelihood cost, okay? P of data set given theta, and then you'll obtain your mu's and sigmas, okay? That's it. But you can see more details into this weight uncertainty for neural networks. I thought it's cool that they use it for Thompson sampling. So we've seen Thompson sampling of the Q distribution using ensembles. We have it here also with Bayesian networks. I think it's nice that we see tools, and then we can also, relate to the papers in the literature. I feel, given this introduction, if you read the variational time encoder tutorial and the weight uncertainty paper, you will be able to completely understand the details. Now, having said that, you can say, sure, you can take stochastic networks, you can take prediction error, but you can also have an alternative objective about learning progress. And so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but basically, the straightforward way to estimate your learning progress, you keep a buffer, you take a state, you update your prediction model, and you take this buffer, run your new prediction model, see if your prediction errors went down, and if they went down, then you reward, let's say, this state, you give high reward. Basically, you don't reward the prediction error, you reward the reduction of the prediction error. Okay, that's learning progress. Because I don't want to spend much time, I would like to tell you that in this paper, Variational Information Maximization Exploration, they used exactly this BaseNet. That's why I described it to you, how to train it. Because they used exactly the same setup, and they defined their reward as this. The KL divergence between the weights before the transition and after the transition. So you have a BaseNet, you train it, you have a new transition, you retrain, you see how much the theta changed. What does it mean theta changed? High KL divergence between before and after. And you take this as your reward. That's it, okay? And look, same things. The Q is identical. It is a product of Gaussians. Here we have this exploration bonus, exactly the same minimization we saw in the previous slide. And yes, it helps. Now, having said that, Deepak Pathak, that is the author of the previous paper, Large-Scale Exploration, implemented this and couldn't get this to work. So that's another story. Now I'm going to close by giving you one example of exploration on a real robot. All right? Now, in real robots, things work very differently. Here's a paper from Peterson. They said, we're going to focus with model-based RL, because if you go with model-free RL, it will never work on the real robot. What does it mean model-based? Let's try to learn the reward function and the transition function. Let's focus on the transition function. They use the random forest. Why we like random forest? Not only that decision forests are high capacity, but if you put random, you put many trees together, and you have uncertainty. You can look at the entropy of the trees and say, high entropy, I'm not sure about this transition. Low entropy, I'm sure about this transition. So this is nice. Now, what will be the reward? So they combine two. One, the entropy of the trees, the transitions, as well as the state density. Because they say, and it is very logical, you have never been in the different room. How is that your transition model that you're training supposed to take a completely new image and tell you whether it's going to be high curiosity or not? Of course it's going to be high curiosity. It has never even seen this input. The thing is that Bayesian net better, really respond, saying that, look, I haven't seen that input. Each of my sample weights shows different thing. Yes. Now, if you use a regression network, it won't be able to tell you that I haven't seen this input. Okay. You hope that the prediction error will be high. So they use combined rewards. That's all. Now let me show you a demo. There is nothing interesting here. Here's the demo. Here is the now, the robot. It has a button on its foot, and it has a pink patch. And this is the actions it can do. Okay, it can move its arm. And the question is, the state, so we should always ask what should be a state and action representation. So this is what I wrote down there. The actions are these motions. The state is the angles, the hand, how much pink it sees and how much it hears. Okay? Now the interesting thing is the following. You can use curiosity to learn models fast, good models fast. Random exploration, which is what most people use to learn models, okay? Move around randomly, take experience tuples, train your model, okay? Is not, you're going to waste a lot of experience. If while you are about to take the action, you do online planning, they do something like Monte Carlo tree search with learn dynamics in this case, okay? You try to pick the action that you think is going to cause you the highest prediction error, the highest and the most novel state, this is even better. So more on model-based reinforcement learning this Wednesday. That's it, I attended. Great. Yes.
It's not obvious to me why would you ever use just curiosity-based learning and not give a reward for the actual task that you're interested in?
Yes, I agree. So first of all, for the actual task you're interested in, imagine you want to put a robot in front of a bunch of toys, okay? And imagine that you take baby toys. And baby toys have a lot of manipulation skills. Sometimes you need to press a button, sometimes you need to close the flap, you need to move the lever, you need to do this, that. Does this make sense? Do you agree with this? There are a lot of things that you care to solve. I mean, it's not about publishing a paper, it's about really learning something. Now, if you want to put rewards, you need to code up a reward for every little thing on the toy. Is this what you do to your baby? No. The baby plays and it's time it sees something different, something that moves different, sounds different, it gets happy. And then after a little bit, it forgets and wants a different toy because it already knows the dynamics of the previous toy. Basically, it requires a lot of engineering. I mean, we say that rewards are the simplest one to code and it's the least supervision, but if you really want to scale with multitask and multi-goal learning, it's still tons and tons of supervision, right? Do you agree? Now, interesting, they showed in this paper that you can pre-train with curiosity. You have now the model, and now I'm going to give you task-related rewards, and you'll be able to do well. Okay? All right, thank you. Sorry about that.
I want to talk about some work that tries to relate, and this is described in chapter 15, the ideas we've been talking about of reinforcement learning algorithms to how animals and people learn. And actually, I tried to write a paper along with Ken Katinger, who studies human learning a lot. Ken and I tried to co-author a paper called Machine Learning and Human Learning. We finally gave up because we couldn't find enough good examples of how machine learning algorithms actually mimic what we know about human learning. But the very best example we came up with, which made us try in the first place, was really around reinforcement learning. So this is really, if people ask me what is the best example of how what we know about human learning and machine learning come into alignment, my answer is reinforcement learning. So let me show it this way. Here's an experiment conducted on a monkey. And the monkey had a probe in its brain that was recording from a single neuron. And well, let me say this. The monkey was, every once in a while, given sugar on its tongue, which monkeys like sugar, just like people. And what you see here up in the upper right corner is a plot of the spiking of that neuron over time. And where you see the R, that is the point in time where the sugar went on the monkey's tongue. And the way to read this plot is that ignore the little well, the top part of the plot is really a histogram that's summing up all the spikes in the rows that are below. And each row is one trial. It's one time sequence. And the dots show the spiking of that one individual neuron during a time sequence. Each row is a different trial. Okay. So then you can see from the histogram there that if you average over a number of trials, that this particular neuron fires when the monkey gets sugar on its tongue, which is very interesting. And so if I asked you, what do you think is the information that neuron is encoding, you might think, for example, it could be the reward signal. Okay, here's another experiment on the same monkey. In this case, there's a conditioning stimulus, a blink of light, that occurs 1 second before the sugar appears. And once the monkey learns that a blink of light is a good thing because it's going to be followed a second later by sugar, here is the spiking profile of that very same neuron. So apparently this neuron is not simply recording the reward, which is the sugar still, but it's recording something else.
A value function.
Yes?
A value function.
A value
The
function.
way we know when the uncertainty for the future expected reward goes down, right?
Right,
Something
right.
equivalent.
So it's got to be related to, or perhaps related to the value function. Let me show you a third experiment, same monkey. Once the monkey learned that the light would be followed by sugar a second later, what happens if you don't give the monkey the sugar? This is a cruel experiment. So you blink the light and then you don't give the sugar. Here's what happens. So now when the sugar is supposed to appear, it doesn't. There's a suppression of the background level of activity in this neuron. So as Katerina is suggesting, this neuron is doing something much more interesting than simply recording that sugar is appearing. And so if you try to model what it's doing, the best model is actually to say, this is the Bellman error. This is the temporal difference error between what the monkey, if you imagine that the monkey has a value function and it's perceiving rewards, and you work out what a simple value function learning system would do in this case, it predicts perfectly this behavior. Because if you think about it, before the monkey knows the value function, say it has value function being 0 everywhere, it's not expecting reward, then the error is going to be 0 minus 0. It's just going to be the reward. When a reward occurs, the monkey wasn't expecting it. That's the error. That's the temporal difference error. That's what we see in the top plot. Once the monkey learns that the light blink is basically a state where there's a high reward, then it's going along. It doesn't know when the light is going to blink. But then when the light blinks, all of a sudden it now anticipates the reward. And so this is the point in time at which the surprise happens, the unexpected increase. Now that the light has blinked, the value is high. Before it was low. And so there's a big difference here. And then again here later, when the monkey believes that the light precedes the reward, then again here, when the light blinks, that's a pleasant surprise. But then there's the unpleasant surprise here when the reward doesn't actually appear. And again, that's another non-zero Bellman error. Okay, so this is what I mean when I say that reinforcement learning has a very interesting relationship to what we see in neural activity in monkeys. Okay. We see the same thing in humans. That experiment on monkeys was done in the late 90s, but more recently we have things like functional MRI where we can look inside people's brains without sticking needles in their head. And so Peter Diane and some other people did a study where they put people in a scanner and they presented people with basically a sequence of actions that form a Markov process. And they would get a sequence of 2 cues after which they would get a lot of pain or a little pain. Sorry about that. It's even more cruel than withholding the sugar. But that was the experiment they did. And then as you can see here, at the first position, they could have Q, A, or C. At the second position, they could have Q, B, or D. And then finally, they would experience either low or high pain. And so as people were learning this, they were recording their brain activity brain-wide with fMRI. And so now again, if you apply temporal difference learning, say Q learning, or value function learning with a model, where the model is simply weight, and your action is weight, then what you'll see is that before learning, the temporal difference error is given by the dotted line here. When you're done learning, the solid line shows what happens. So for example, let's take this Q. QA, you're going to learn that QA followed by QD is low pain. Eventually you're going to learn that. But unfortunately, QA is usually followed by QB, which has high pain. So here you're going to, the temporal difference value will be when you see QA, all of a sudden you think you're going to get a lot of pain. But then when you see it was followed by QD, then now you're in better shape. Whereas if you got QA on the top row there, followed by QB, it's even worse pain you're going to experience. And then you get the pain, and now going forward, you're not expecting a big problem. And then here becomes the temporal difference prediction error at that point. You didn't know what Q is coming. Unfortunately, it's QA. That's a problem. But then it's QD. That's a pleasant surprise. So again, you can map out exactly what the temporal difference errors are at the stage where you haven't learned the model as a person in the scanner, the stage where you've partly learned it, and the stage where you've finally perfectly learned it. So what they did was they looked for places in the brain where the activity correlated with these plots. And what they found was that there were several places in the brain, shown here in yellow, where, in fact, the neural activity during the experiment correlated very strongly with the temporal difference error. So not only in monkeys, but in us humans, we also see strong evidence that whatever the brain is doing, part of it is encoding what we've been calling the temporal difference error, the observed reward plus the difference in the value functions. So this leads people, so that's the main experimental result. In both monkeys and people, we see this interesting neural activity. So what that means about how brains learn is still not fully understood. Has led some people to propose models of learning in the brain that look like this. But there are a couple more details that are known. One is that the neurons in the monkey, and apparently in the humans, that are that are demonstrating this behavior are associated with dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain that is also associated with addiction, actually. And it turns out there are certain neurons in the brain that express this neurotransmitter called dopamine. Here is a plot showing the tree or arbor of connectivity from one dopamine neuron, and it's 500,000 connections to other neurons in the brain. By the way, this is exceptional. On average, most neurons in the brain have 50,000 connections, and dopamine neurons have about an order of magnitude more. And so they connect to many other places. Here, these arrows indicate the locations of those dopamine neurons, and the arrows here show what parts of the brain they reach out into. So there's a particular region in the brain. You can see their fun names here. But the interesting thing is people think dopamine is associated with reward or surprise in the brain. And the physical evidence is that they project throughout the brain in this way. There's also a lot more detail known, and we won't go into it today since it's not really a neuroscience class, but you all know that neurons talk to each other through synapses. And so this top right, which is labeled cortical input, is just the end of one neuron coming from cortex. And then here's another neuron in the striatus, which is a region of the brain that is being communicated to from the cortical input, and it involves transfer of different chemicals. Interestingly, the dopamine neuron also projects into the same general region, but not quite the same place. So the space between the cortical input and the dendrite is called the synapse. That's where the communication happens. And it turns out these dopamine neurons project in what we call the postsynapse part of the neuron. That is the synapse where the communication happens, but then the dopamine is somehow communicating with the receiver, not the sender of the information at the synapse. And all these arrows and little chemical names just are an indication that we don't really know what's going on, but it's under a lot of study. So maybe I'll just finish up with this slide. But in general, if you ask, what do we know about how brains learn? And every time I get a chance to ask a neuroscientist, a cell-level neuroscientist, this question, I always do, and they always give me the same answer, which is the only mechanisms we know are these three. The neuroscientists tell me that the only mechanisms we know are all about strengthening connectivity at the synapses. The simplest version of this, which is called Hebbian learning, many people phrase it with this slogan: if you fire together, you wire together. Which means if there's a synapse and the incoming signal fires, the incoming neuron fires, and so does the outgoing neuron, then that synaptic wake will be strengthened. The next more specific version of this is called spike timing dependent plasticity, which just means the timing matters on that, the detailed timing. So for example, if the incoming neuron fires 20 milliseconds before the outgoing neuron, then the synapse will be strengthened. But the timing really matters if, in fact, the sequence is the other way. If the incoming neuron fires after the outgoing neuron, then that connection will actually be weakened. So somehow timing plays an important role. And this is a whole dimension of the problem that we don't think of as much in the algorithms that we're talking about. But it's kind of intriguing to think about what's going on there. The third version of this, which is less understood and more contentious, is that at least for some neurons, it appears that this spike timing dependent plasticity exists, but there's another condition which must occur in order for the synapse to strengthen, which is that it only will happen if some neuromodulator, in particular dopamine for many of these neurons, follows that communication across the synapse within some window of time. And that window of time can be up to many seconds. And this partly goes along with some other results that show the biology that's going on that actually chemically changes the cells so that the strengthening occurs is a chemical reaction, a biochemical reaction that, in fact, requires multiple seconds to complete. And so there are ways of inhibiting or preventing that, the progression of that biochemical change at the synapse. And it appears that these neuromodulators, so one hypothesis is that the neuromodulators in that way can actually govern what gets learning. So if you think about it, you can think of the dopamine as having an effect on these, on the learning at the synapse level. And the first results that I showed for the monkey and for the human are in regions of the brain where there are neurons that either are generating the dopamine or that are sensitive to the dopamine, and the dopamine causes their firing rates to change. Okay, there's a much longer story, but what I really wanted to do is just not let us go through this course without realizing that there's actually a very interesting correspondence here. And in fact, there's been a lot of research over the last 15 years now, maybe a little longer, where I think it's fair to say that without the input from computer science and reinforcement learning in particular, it would have been a lot harder for the neuroscientists to make sense out of the different signals that they were observing. And so really reinforcement learning is an example of a situation where these algorithms designed for engineering purposes actually give us the most useful perspective we have to date for making sense out of what we see in biology. The transfer in the other direction we haven't seen very much, but you can see that there's a lot of subtlety to the biology itself, and maybe sometime in the future we'll see feedback in the other direction that'll help us make better reinforcement learning algorithms. Time will tell. Maybe you'll do that. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say.